In 2025, Japan is introducing a record-setting budget worth over 115.5 trillion yen. That's approximately 770 billion US dollars, which is an insane amount. But this spending is necessary. As the country continues to grapple with an aging population, persistent deflationary pressures, and rising geopolitical threats, the Japanese budget is a signal of the government's priorities, challenges, and its strategic vision for economic revitalization. And that's what we are going to discuss in today's video: Japan's bold $770 billion plan for 2025. Let's first start with the basics and graph out where Japan will spend this big amount of money. Here, on the graph, is a table comparing the previous year, 2024, to the new year, which is 2025. You can see that the increase is going from 112 trillion yen to 115 trillion yen, an increase of approximately 2.9 trillion yen. But where are they going to spend the 115 trillion yen? Well, if we graph out the 2025 budget, specifically, we get to see that a lot of this is going to general expenditure, which usually takes up the bulk of Japanese budget spendings. The general expenditure, as you can see in the graph, is spent on social security, national defense, public works, education and science, and so on. The second here is the local allocation tax grants, which are used to help Japan's regional and local governments continue their services. This is important because not all prefectures in Japan are rich like Tokyo or Osaka. Many smaller towns and aging communities rely heavily on these grants to keep hospitals, schools, and basic infrastructure running. Then thirdly, as you can see, there is the National Debt Service. They are expected to have interest payments of over 10.5 trillion yen and redemption of national debt, which is 17.6 trillion yen. These are massive, and the National Debt Service of Japan is going to cover 24.4% of the total expenditure of Japan for that year. Now, these are the general expenditures, an overview of the Japanese budget. What we need to understand is the massive changes in the budget. What is Japan focusing on for 2025 is the question we need to understand. And one of the biggest increases is no other than defense and security. Over the past few years, Japan has faced growing regional threats from China, North Korea, and an unpredictable global security environment. With this in mind, Japan is set to increase their defense spending to a massive 8.7 trillion yen, which is a 9.4% increase from the previous year. That's one of the biggest increases in the entire budget of Japan for 2025. What could they possibly be buying or using the funds for? Well, some reports says that they allocated massive funds to acquire advanced weaponry, including US-made Tomahawk cruise missiles and domestically developed Type 12 anti-ship missiles. Additionally, investments in next-generation destroyers and joint development of a fighter jet with the UK and Italy. Beyond military spending, Social Security is also seeing a significant increase. Social Security in Japan has rapidly been rising in the past few years. An important part of Japan spending for Social Security, however, is their support to increase the country's birth rate. The current Prime Minister of Japan, who is known as Shigeru Ishiba, has announced the Children's Future Strategy, which is a comprehensive set of measures designed to reduce the burden on families and encourage child rearing. The strategy aims to provide seamless support for children and their families. For example, the government is expanding subsidies for education by pushing for free high school education and lowering the costs for higher education. Additional measures are focused on enhancing childcare services, such as improving the quality and availability of childcare facilities, especially for one-year-olds, as well as increasing childcare leave benefits so that parents can more easily take time off to care for their children. In total, the Social Security spending is set to rise to approximately 38.3 trillion yen in 2025. The budget for the Children's Future Strategy is reported to be an estimated 3.6 trillion yen. Another important spending for the year 2025 is the so-called regional revitalization. This is an important spending for Japan because the government is going to double the spending from 2024 to 2025, from 100 billion yen to over 200 billion. This is done because many local areas, especially in rural regions, have been losing population and struggling with economic decline. Why is this so important? In Japan, many young people move to big cities like Tokyo in search of better jobs and opportunities, leaving behind rural areas. When population declines, local communities suffer because there are fewer workers, less demand for local businesses, and a reduced tax base. This makes it difficult to keep schools open, hospitals running, and infrastructure maintained. The extra funds will help these areas invest in projects that create jobs, improve services, and revitalize local economies. Finally, let's talk about how the government of Japan is going to finance this enormous spending. Here's a graph on their general account total revenue. This is the money that they collect either from taxes, some other forms of revenue streams, and of course, through bond issuance. Here in the graph, you can see that they are going to receive revenues of over 78.4 trillion yen from tax and stamp revenues, which is over 67.9%. Then there's the government bonds issuance at 28.6 trillion yen, which is what we are going to discuss extensively later. Then you can also see others in the list at 8.5 trillion yen. It could include fees, fines, income from government-owned assets, and contributions from special accounts. Now, let's talk about government bonds issuance. These government bonds issuance is basically Japan's borrowing of money, also known as debt. 28.6 trillion yen of borrowing is massive, but it's actually not that big if we compare it to previous borrowings. For example, here's a graph on Japan's bond issuance per year. Here you can see that for the year 2025, they aren't actually going to borrow a lot of money. 28.6 trillion yen is the lowest since 2009. The reason why this is the case is because of the record tax revenue increase in Japan. This helps the Japanese government to rely less on borrowing to finance its budget. For instance, here's a graph on Japan's general account tax revenue. Here, you can see that the highest ever was in 2022, but 2025 is bound to surpass that. This is a good sign for Japan's fiscal health, as it can help reduce their high public debt levels, which are more than double its annual economic output. Moreover, if we graph out the bond dependency ratio, which measures how much of Japan's annual budget is being paid for using borrowed money, we can see a clear improvement in 2025. The bond dependency ratio for 2025 is expected to fall below 25%, which isn't just a small figure. It's actually the lowest since the 1990s, indicating that Japan is slowly becoming less reliant on debt to fund its national budget. This is a major milestone for a country that has spent decades borrowing heavily to pay for social services, economic stimulus, and disaster recovery. This is why, if we were to graph out the government debt to GDP of Japan, the country is expected to see a decrease to just 211%. It's still massive, but it's an improvement since the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, and the years following that. The only bad part about Japan's debt right now is that Japan's interest rates have been rising. If we were to look at the graph on Japan's interest rates, we would see a clear rise from the past few years. This is because the Bank of Japan has started to end its ultra-loose monetary policy, which it had maintained for nearly 2 decades. For years, Japan kept interest rates extremely low, even negative at times, to stimulate the economy, encourage borrowing, and combat deflation. But in 2024, the Bank of Japan began gradually raising rates, signaling confidence that inflation is finally returning and the economy is slowly gaining traction. The problem that this brings is, of course, if we see the data for Japan's interest payments and compare it to previous years, we get to see that it has increased to over 10.5 trillion yen in 2025 from just 8.2 trillion yen back in 2024. Unfortunately, this isn't really a good sign for Japan's fiscal future. In fact, it's a warning. Even though Japan is reducing how much it borrows in 2025, the cost of borrowing is rising fast. The increase from 8.2 trillion yen to 10.5 trillion yen in just 1 year means Japan is paying over 2 trillion yen more just in interest. That's money that isn't being used for schools, hospitals, regional development, or social programs. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.